I'm Josh Weldon, and on this episode of In the Workshop, I want to take you into balance. I always like to talk about, right off the beginning, like if you're a fan of baseball, you see somebody get in a batter's box and they get, they bend their knees, they have their core section over their knees, their weight's balanced right, they keep their arms tucked in. You look at a boxer, his stance is such that, it's really hard to knock him over. And it's also important in welding, in MIG, TIG, stick, gas welding if you're gas welding. And the reason is that, so here's the deal. I'm super shaky. I've always been super shaky. Like, there's that new app going around that shows like, hey, look what I do and how steady my hands are. And my hands look like, they just look blurry. So I've always had to come up with unique ways to steady myself. And I think that, I remember the first time I ever saw somebody weld, it was John Kaser at Macomb College, and he was gas welding, and he sat down at the table, and he's got his rod here, and he's got his torch here, and he's welding like this, but he's steady as a rock. Like the dude was just solid, and he's super steady. And I turned to the guy next to me, I'm like, man, if that's what it takes to weld, I'm out. Like, I can't do that. But luckily, there are tricks to make yourself steadier. And a big part of that is figuring out a way to get the right balance. So for TIG welding, for instance, so say even you're welding at a bench, you're just welding on a table, and some of this is gonna be, it's kind of beginner stuff. Other people might look at it and be like, oh, it kind of, a bell goes off in their head and they're like, okay, I can do something a little bit different. So just, if it applies to you, cool. If not, no worries. So with a TIG torch, I see a lot of starters when they first start welding, they have their arms out like this and they're trying to feed this in. But if you have, let's say you're doing that and you're welding like this, every shakiness from your arm, from your most solid point, like in your midsection through your arms, unless you're just like super steady, in that case, do whatever you want. But if you're really trying to steady yourself, you want to create an anchor point or like a fulcrum point as close to the weld as possible. So like I end up a lot of times, it depends on what you do. There's some stuff where it's going to be so hot where you can't have your hands close to that, so close to the weld. But then there's other welds, like a lot of my sculptures, I actually will take the torch and I'll wrap it up in my hand like this because there's just not that much heat to deal with. But a lot of times if I'm doing bench welding, TIG welding, what I'll do is there's a couple of ways you can do it. One of the ways that's popular is, you slide your hand. So you're always trying to maintain that steady angle, the steady work distance. And so some people they'll just slide like this. I've never had much luck doing that. And maybe again, it's the shakiness, but to me, too often something will snag, the glove will snag, or you're gonna hit a piece of slag and you'll jump. I like to do a different way, and to me, it gives me more control, although it is a little bit more complicated, but after doing it for a while, it becomes second nature. I like to use this part of my torch hand, and I rest it on the table, and then I use my pinky and the next finger for support. So I'll actually sort of creep along as I'm going, and I'm using my whole hand really gradually. And I mean, you're looking at the video now, it's super shaky, but when I actually weld, it'll look better. So you're kind of just inching your hand and your whole hand's moving, but it's to keep that angle and that stick off where you want it. So I'll get to the end, and then my two bottom fingers are kind of what's pushing me along. So like, say I've got this piece right here, do a quick little weld. So I got my, holding your torch, that's the other thing, is get comfortable, like however you want to hold it. But I'm going to hold it sort of like a pencil grip. So I got between my thumb and my forefinger, and then I use this finger to kind of help maneuver it. So I've got actually pressure on the palm of my hand, and then on the tips of my two bottom fingers, and that's what's helping to steady me. And then gradually they're just kind of inching along. So you can see, like, My fingers here are kind of what's helping me steady. So I'm that close to the point of weld, like the point where you're welding, wherever you're making that arc. In this case, it's the tungsten to the workpiece. So I'm super close to that. So any shakiness is just from here to here. Now, if I were to try to weld, like, let's say I've got this sitting out here and I'm welding up here, then all this is gonna hurt my steadiness. If I have it here, then it's the same thing, like any shakiness from here to here. So the closer you can get to the weld while still protecting your hands, while still, you know, being able to weld practically, you know, you get as close as possible. And that's on every process. So if I'm MIG welding, you know, you don't have to worry about your offhand as far as filling metal. So sometimes I'll even, if I'm doing like really heavy stuff, if I'm at work doing a bunch of pulse aluminum on like 2-inch thick stuff, I'll get like a really heavy duty MIG glove on my left hand. And then on my right hand, I'll either get a light duty MIG glove or even a TIG glove because I'm farther away from the heat. But I'll use my left hand to support the gun as close as possible to the weld. And it's the same deal. The idea is you're cutting off all the shakiness past the hands, past the fulcrum point. So you really are only steadying, you know, 3 or 4 inches instead of trying to steady 2 feet, 2 arms, all this kind of stuff. And the same thing goes for, so if you're doing some out of position welding, and for this I kind of set up a stick weld setup, which I don't usually do in my shop. Sometimes you're gonna have a situation where you can't lean on anything. That's where you really wanna get the athletic stance. So you kind of, you know, you got your knees bent, you got your weight over your knees, and you kind of tuck your elbows in, because that helps steady yourselves too. So you tuck your elbows in and then come in like this. And now I've got my hands, so you know it's still kind of shaky. It's from here to here, so there's some shakiness going on, but I can at least almost rest the stick on the workpiece. The other option is, if you really need to get some steadiness, what you can do is, give me a second. Let's say you've got like a pipe up in the air or something. Grab a broom and lean it up against something. You can lean up against that. That's a trick that you can use. A couple other things. Let's say you're doing a vertical and you just really don't have any place to rest. You know, get out a vice grip, and then you can use that as kind of a rest. It works on pipe, or you can get those the vice grips that have kind of the chains around them, and you can wrap it around the pipe and use that as a spot to rest against. A lot of times I'll take a C-clamp just to give me the leverage and the angle that I want. So then I'm not worried about my whole body shaking, I'm just worried about this part. So, you know, I've got steadiness right here, and I'm only worried about that shakiness from here to the workpiece instead of like basically from my feet to the workplace. I had a guy that I worked with once who his instructor told him he wanted him to practice as he's learning in the most uncomfortable positions, because he'd have to weld in uncomfortable positions later. That's the complete wrong way to look at it. You want to weld, when you're learning, you want to be set up for success. And welding flat, welding vertical, even at your table, you're developing muscle memory. So then when you get to a spot where it's going to be uncomfortable, you're still going to make yourself as comfortable as possible. Sometimes that's still going to be kind of shaky, but then you're going to be able to fall back on that muscle memory. And like I've had welding on a scissor lift on a giant overhead door, and the scissor lift is kind of swaying. I would actually wrap my one arm around the door that I'm, like a brace on the door that I'm working on to hold myself in, and then weld with the other arm just to kind of mitigate the shakiness from the scissor lift. So even though that was an uncomfortable position, I'm getting as comfortable as I can to make the weld. And really, the only limit is your imagination, and then if there's any rules, like you're not gonna be, you know, welding on things to lean against usually. But clamps, C-clamps, those kind of things come in really, really handy. And it's the same thing with MIG. You know, same kind of deal. You rest it, and now all of a sudden you've got a really easy thing instead of trying to, you know, steady yourself like that, which you still have to do sometimes. But to me, it's about making yourself, there's no bonus points for being super uncomfortable. Like, you're gonna be in kind of bad situations, but you make the best of it. So that's kind of my whole spiel. I started a lot of the workshops with that, with beginner welders, just like, know your body, know that if there's certain unsteadiness that you can work on that and you can make yourself steadier. Because me, I'm shaky as heck. Like, I've always have been. It's just something I've always dealt with, but I made it work, and you can too.